Today we'll be chatting with West Marrin. West is an applied scientist and educator, as well as a founder of an NGO, two private firms, a multimedia forum, and a consultancy that assists environmental, entrepreneurial, and educational groups with water-related issues. He's authored 3 books about the science and uniqueness of water, as well as a range of journal articles addressing water pollution and remediation, hydromimicry, aquatic chemistry and ecology, water resource allocation, and the water-energy food nexus. He lectures on the topics of global water quality, local water footprints, sustainable water technologies, and collaborations among scientists, artists, and engineers in communicating and addressing water challenges. He's a former adjunct professor at San Diego State University and received his PhD in water resources from the University of Arizona. His interest in water is also related to a lifetime of experiential endeavors such as surfing, scuba diving, and exploring. I know you'll enjoy this conversation with West Marrin. Let's dive in. Before we get our feet wet with this week's topic, make sure you're subscribed so you always get the current episode. And if you take a minute to write a review, this helps others to find this wellspring of hydrating wisdom too. I pour out my thanks to you for taking the time to water this podcast so it can grow by sharing your review. Hello, West Marrin. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much for joining the Water is Life podcast. I have been a huge fan of your work ever since I first discovered you several years ago. I've read most of the things that you've ever written, probably at least everything I could get my hands on. So I'm really excited to bring your insights and your wisdom to the Water is Life community today. And I thought we could kick things off by maybe a little story time, if you're open to it. I'm really curious to hear how you first fell in love with water. Like, what were your first aha moments when you really started to realize that there's a lot more to water than people typically realize?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to the podcast, Isabel. I really appreciate it. And I've actually followed your work of late. I learned of you through a mutual friend, and it's been a pleasure to understand and find out some of the work that you're doing as well. Let's see, water. I grew up on the coast in Southern California, so I spent a lot of time at the beach and in the water. And it was really kind of an escape for me into a different world. And whether I'd put my goggles on or my mask on and look what was beneath the water, or just in the water itself, either bobbing or later surfing, it became, a real source of not only pleasure, but a real source of connection to the earth for me. And I think that my aha with water came in my early teens as I was surfing and running my hands across the surface of the water. And suddenly I had this realization about the smoothness, and there must be a coherence in this water that I never even realized. And that was kind of as much experiential as it was intuitional. And I think from there, my interest in water just grew over time. So it was spending more time in water, eventually through my education in science, then turning to water as my primary focus, and then into my career, which is pretty much centered entirely on water. Very different aspects of water, but water nonetheless.
Very different aspects of water. Yeah, you cover a lot of ground in your work. There are a lot of different facets of water that you speak to brilliantly, and particularly in your books, Altered Perceptions and Hydromimicry, you dive into some of the ways that shifting our perception of water and shifting our relationship to water can really provide solutions to some of humanity's toughest conundrums. So can you share with the audience a little bit about how water provides solutions in the realms of ecology and climate and potentially even energy production?
Sure. Well, first of all, this is a water planet. And so everything that goes on here physically, chemically, and every other way just about is through water. I mean, this is the medium. Schwenk used to call it the universal mediator, or a mediator, which was the title of my first book. And I think that's really paramount because water is so subtle. And things in nature that are the most powerful are always the most subtle. So they're the most easily overlooked. And as a consequence of that, we're looking for all the other things that water modulates or assists or mediates without looking at the water itself. So that sort of becomes kind of the inert background. And I think that's the major kind of misconception with regard to water, that it is the mover and shaker. Everything else is moving to its rhythm rather than those things setting up the rhythm or the geometry or whatever. And it's kind of a photographic negative of how we've viewed water and learned about water in a conventional Western setting. So one of the things that I've been concerned about, I've worked with water both on sort of the molecular level and then sort of on the environmental level. And one of the things that's always disturbed me is that we tend to, as an engineering kind of focused society, we tend to want to impose our particular ideas about water on the water itself. Instead of looking at water and how it behaves in nature and then trying to emulate what water is doing the best we can in terms of our technologies and things like that. And I've sort of coined this phrase, although it was first brought to my attention by a Maori engineer in New Zealand. And it was, which is really sort of analogous to biomimicry. And that is changing our perspective. And instead of trying to brute force engineer water to do what we wanted to do, put it in canals, do that, so forth and so on. Look at the patterns, look at the rhythms, look at the tendencies that water follows on the earth, because those are the natural ways in which this planet functions, and try to emulate those. And whether it is through climate, in terms of, even things like geoengineering, which I'm not a huge fan of because I think it has the potential to bring about a lot of unwanted side effects, because we don't really understand these systems well enough, I think, to be able to be messing with them, to relatively mundane things like how we move water, emulating how a tree moves water rather than pushing it with a pump. Things like, when we lay out a community or build things, to be very cognizant of what that watershed looks like, where that water moves, how it moves, and accommodate that into our planning rather than trying to plan something out from our own brains, which are really not often in touch with observing the patterns and the rhythms of water in the earth.
What would be some examples of ways that humanity could practice hydromimicry, and how would that shift our current paradigm?
Yeah, I think if we turn to the geoengineering, for instance, there's a real move afoot in desperation, I think, more than anything else, depending on the speed in which the effects of climate change start to affect the functioning of the institutions and everything else on this planet, to try to, either block the sunlight or increase the amount of radiation that's released back into the atmosphere without causing this greenhouse effect. And some of it has to do with, for instance, in the oceans, spreading iron, which is a limiting resource for phytoplankton and other kinds of things, to take up carbon dioxide and to release oxygen. And I think we need to instead realize that the ocean has its own way of dealing with both carbon dioxide and heat, and it's absorbing it the best that it can right now at whatever level of absorption is going on. And that to try to force it to do more than it's doing is probably not a way to do it. So in this way, we're mimicking and letting the oceans do their thing without trying to push their limits as far as we possibly can, because we don't know whether that'll backfire. And it's also a matter, I think, of respecting the way that water moves on this planet, its roles, and, as you often mention, its wisdom. And however that wisdom is defined, it's definitely there. And it's definitely something that's been around this planet for the last 4 billion years without any help at all from humans.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And it seems like the more we turn to nature, like Schauberger said, comprehend and copy nature. That's basically the blueprint for our pathway forward. And when we look at the way that nature does things, she centers the primacy of water in in all living systems. And if we were to create human systems that are more like living systems, they would center the primacy of water. And it really comes down to, as you said, respect and having that relationship where we honor and respect and humble ourselves to learn from water rather than, imposing water into our systems and our ideas of how and where she should flow and this sort of thing. Because when you create that reciprocity, that communication with water, there's so much that she can teach and there's so much she can guide us through. But humanity, we just have this hubris. Where does that come from? In thinking that we know everything, that we've got better solutions than nature. I find it really fascinating, this idea that the wisdom that water is bringing through, that she's bringing it actually from the etheric field, from this quantum field. And that's something that you've written about at length, this water's relationship to the ether. I'm wondering if you can share a bit with the audience about that. What is water's relationship to the etheric field?
Well, yeah, that sort of goes back to what ancient peoples have left us, at least the start of it. And that is, I got very interested in why they referred to kind of what we call the absolute, or however we want to call that, something beyond everything else, from which everything else is a function. They called it the waters of chaos, and many different cultures did so. And this idea that water was the best metaphor for something that is the absolute is fascinating me. What is it about that would allow them to make that kind of relationship? And I think it's very much a function of the view and the intuition that everything that we see actually comes through water. It's this idea of water being a mediator in everything from biology, so that we're looking at the structure and function of macromolecules, things like DNA and protein. They're all hydrated. They never really touch each other. Everything is communicated through the water because everything is hydrated. And water acting as this kind of mediator between different forms of energy and different forms of matter, is pretty much ubiquitous, at least on this planet, as far as we know. And, the presence of water throughout the cosmos is something that, fascinated, astronomers when they first found that out. And I think that that's really sort of the essence of this whole idea that water is the best representation of this absolute. And the relationship even goes so far as things like platonic solids, so that in ancient times, water was represented by the icosahedron, and the ether, however you want to call it, was represented by the dodecahedron, which are basically the sort of the matching or the complementary platonic solids. So one of the ways that I've sort of looked at this in a mystical way is that maybe water is the physical manifestation of a non-physical, non-manifested kind of energy or realm, or however one wants to define it. So I think that's a very interesting way to sort of look at water. Not a terribly scientific way, but I have a foot in both camps. I have a foot in the very much the scientific camp, and then one in the camp that says there's so much that we don't know about water that the ancients may have, and indigenous peoples, and even a lot of people today may intuitive about water that may be right on, although we can't explain it from any kind of a scientific viewpoint now because we're just not there yet.
Yeah, water is really the great mystery. The more we peer into it, the more questions we have rather than answers. But you're right, so many of the ancients did provide, if not answers, some really fascinating questions. And you see this cross-culturally in ancient indigenous water wisdom, and then in the mystery schools and even holy water traditions in the various religions. The fact that in the Bible it says that you can only enter the kingdom of heaven through water and the spirit. And maybe water and the spirit are, as you said, two sides of the same coin, that it's kind of the mediator between the manifest and the non-manifest, between the human and the heavenly, and that different forms of water are likely able to conduct that mediation in more or less effective ways. That, the more crystalline and living water is, the more it is in touch with that universal life force that is itself unmanifest, but manifests through the vehicle of water.
And this gets us really back to what is water? What is it about water? I'm going to put my foot now back into the scientific bucket. And what is it about water that's so unique and makes it behave the way it does, is responsible for all its unusual physical and chemical properties? What is that? And basically, it comes down to, from a scientific viewpoint, that it's a network. It's a hydrogen bonded network. So it's not a matter of individual water molecules running around and bumping into each other haphazardly. It's a very structured network, and it's connected worldwide and through everything. And, you mentioned, geometries and rhythms, just the exchanging of the hydrogen bonds in water, goes over many octaves, a huge range of vibrational frequencies, which means that any kind of contact with anything, a force field, an energy, an object, a surface, anything, is going to change the structure of that network locally, which is going to also change the rhythm that it changes by. And it's really fascinating how that may work. I mean, it's been likened to or associated with, what's referred to as, sort of an autopoietic system, one in which, the changing of connections between these water molecules constantly in liquid water up to, 1,000,000,000,000 or more times per second.
Friends, are you thirsty for spring water in its purest, wildest form, untouched by chemicals or processing, but maybe you don't have a nearby spring where you can harvest your own? We've got you covered with Alive Waters. They deliver fresh, raw, unprocessed spring water straight from a pristine, natural primary spring right to your doorstep. This water is wild and undomesticated, just like nature intended, packed with minerals and full of life force energy. And the best part? It's delivered in stunning, eco-friendly Flower of Life glass bottles designed to energize the water even further with sacred geometry. Delivery is available in Austin, San Antonio, Miami, San Francisco, LA, Portland, and New York. If you're not in one of those areas, no worries, you can still order their beautiful Flower of Life glassware from anywhere. Just head over to waterislife.shop for all the details and use the code WaterIsLife for 15% off your order.
Is, really designed to respond to environmental stimuli and to, portray a kind of, if not sentience, at least a kind of response that is very much, that's very much associated with complex systems that can control and can respond and can, and activate. So it's super interesting.
Yeah, I think that's why she's been called the sensitive chaos, because she's so exquisitely sensitive to absolutely everything in the environment and constantly dynamically responding like the primordial mirror that is always reflecting our reality back to us and potentially even patterning reality on some level. The Kogi of Columbia say that water holds the matrix of reality, that she kind of contains this holographic imprint of reality. So one thing that I find fascinating, and again, this spans both camps of the spiritual and the scientific, but water, I think, is the place more than anywhere else where those two meet, where spirit and science meet and mingle and become one another. It's through water. And it's not only the local shifts and changes that she makes in response to her immediate environment, but also the non-locality of the fact that all water is potentially connected to all other water, that in one drop of water, all of the oceans are contained and can be accessed and can be imprinted potentially, that there's this quantum entanglement between all waters. Can you speak to that a bit about water's communion, that potentially the water here on this planet has the ability to commune with even water in deep space and astrohydrophysics?
Yeah. And I think, it's also interesting about water, the questions that came, but where did water come from? And water is found throughout the cosmos, and it has a role, in terms of things like birthing stars, being able to keep the temperature low enough so that, the gases and everything that are the protostar come together and form without blasting apart. And I think, it's worth reiterating that, the water that we see here on Earth that we use all the time may have been part of the water that birthed this planet in the first place. So again, it gives rise to it. So yeah, water is throughout the cosmos. And it is interesting that although I'm not sure how much work is done in terms of non-locality with water molecules as such, that the water throughout the universe is basically the same. It can come in lots of different forms, but it's all this matrix. It forms these associations with other water molecules. And although it seems to be simple from that perspective, it actually creates a system that is ultra complex, that goes between, as you're talking, between chaos and order. And some people have said that basically the bulk water is sort of the chaos, which can then be structured into anything that it needs to be structured in. And then the more structured water that's associated with information or input from the environment is the order. So it's this constant dance and play between chaos and order to keep things open for anything new that may come in, but cognizant in terms of anything that comes into water knows what that is because of the hydration shells that are formed and exactly what that, what's going on there. So it's interesting in that way. It's very fascinating. Yeah.
Endlessly fascinating. So for someone who is just starting to dip their toes into the well of water wisdom and research, can you share a couple of insights that people would find astounding or inspiring or shocking? I know that for me, I've been studying water since 2009, and I still get blown away all the time, learning new things and just continuously in awe. And what have been some things that you've learned that really shocked or inspired you that most people wouldn't consider?
Gee, that's a good question. There's so many things to choose from. One of the things that I've done of late is started to look at the human brain. And the human brain is a complex system where the neurons are connected to one another. And it forms this kind of network from which basically, according to the scientists, consciousness merges. So it's an emergent property. And I think the parallel was really interesting with water because I think a lot of water's behaviors are emergent and they come from this really intricate place where these systems, these networks are able to sort of negotiate this space between chaos and order. And I think one of the parallels that I'm looking at is kind of the patterns in water compared to the patterns in brain. And one of the things that I hope to do is to sort of look at humans, because primarily we're pattern seekers. That's what we do. We look at patterns, we seek patterns out, and then we try to understand what the relationship is between the patterns. So it's identification, correlation, and then basically trying to extend those patterns in our brain to try to figure out what may happen in the future. And I think one of the things that really astounded me is the parallel between how our brain physiologically, at least according to neuroscience, works and the way water works. And that was something that I hadn't expected to see a parallel with at all. So I think that's one of the things that really surprised me. I think the other surprise that was probably the most impactful to me was this whole thing, and I'm going to go back to it, is this whole idea of mediation and how many things in this universe are mediated by water. Because I had no clue. Even though I'd spent time in it, I had no clue that it was as big, as ubiquitous and as involved as it is in everything that goes on. And I remember people telling me early on, this is much bigger than you think it is. And I was, okay, yeah, well, we'll see, And I think that surprised me. And that's why really my reverence from water has come from an awe. It's like, oh my gosh, I had no idea this had A, the capabilities, and B, the ubiquity that it does. And I think that's an appreciation that can change people, but it's a difficult one to conceptualize. And I think that's why so many of the insights that's come from ancient and indigenous and other kinds of people or naturalists texts that you talked about, Schauberger and Schwenk and those, came from not so much mental activity, but contemplating, looking at water, being with water, being in water, which was something that really had a huge effect on me. And I think that those are probably two of the things that just blew me away.
So is it fair to say pretty much nothing happens in this universe without water? Water facilitates anything to actually happen for the most part. Everything that happens through water or as a result of water, mediated by water, that water is kind of this agent of change and birth and death and existence, and is intimately involved with everything, which is one of the things that makes water so challenging to nail down or to speak about in specifics, because it is so broadly applicable to absolutely anything and everything.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. So I don't know. Water then has to be, of course, the hydrogen and oxygen atoms have to be formed by other kinds of processes. But once formed, yeah, it seems to find its way just about where you can believe the photosphere of stars and places that you'd never expect it to be, but in some sort of some phase, solid, liquid, gaseous, supercritical water phase, under high pressure, high temperature, those kinds of things. So
Superionic amorphous ice.
yeah, amorphous ice, all kinds of stuff, carrying what might have been the precursors, the biological precursors to what we refer to as biological life on this planet, on meteorites, on other planetoids, on who knows what comets, who knows what. So it's just
Nano-stirred water in deep space was the origin of RNA, which is the origin of DNA and the origin of dark matter, potentially, according to Cambridge, and all these different things. I think it's even when you're referring to, okay, the hydrogen and the oxygen have to be formed and brought together under the right circumstances, but I feel like it's the etheric field that mediates the birth of everything, of all atoms. And if we're talking about the etheric field as being the non-physical form of water, with the, physical body of water, the solid, liquid, gas, and plasma that we're familiar with being its physicality, but then its spirit or its soul or its mind being the etheric field, then on that non-physical level, it actually brings into being everything else.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ways to look at it. There's so many angles to look at it from, but its ubiquity is really amazing. And everywhere they're looking at, they looked at Mars and they thought, well, once Mars lost its atmosphere, there wouldn't be any water. But there's good evidence that there was surface water, and there may still be a lot of subsurface water on the moons of, Jupiter and other places. It's just really amazing. This molecule, or this collection of molecules, that we refer to as water, this substance, its ability to adapt to environments that we would have never, probably 50 years ago, 75 years ago, would ever dreamed that could ever survive in. Yeah.
Can you share a bit more about how water functions as a brain?
Well, I'm not sure I said it functions as a brain. I think there's a parallel between the idea of relatively simple components, whether it be water molecules or neurons. Not that neurons are simple or water molecules are simple, but the idea that the connections between these, the network that's formed, is very much responsible for some of its unique behaviors and its ability to, as Francisco Varela once said, these kinds of systems can actually express what he called cognitive properties, a response to environmental stimuli that's not only coherent, but consistent. And I think this kind of thing, kind of calls out, if not functionally similar, certainly structurally similar. And that starts to make me think about, what is it? What is it really life? What is life? I'm sure you'll get into the whole idea of living water and what is really living water. And I remember being questioned about that in one of the first talks I ever gave. And somebody said, well, it can't eat, digest, reproduce, do all the other things that are related to biological life. And really the response to that is, what is life? And it may not be these functions that we associate with biological forms, but it may be what scientists are looking at now, and that is the communication of information. And it may all have to do with information, including biological life. And if so, then the similarity between the two is that they're very much involved with information. And when I talk about information, I'm not talking about like news, coming over the internet. I'm talking about changes in the state of any particular system, whatever it is. And I think that there may be some parallel there. So this is a work undone, but it's interesting to look at that. And I'm going to continue to pursue that as my interest in sort of neuroscience has grown, and the idea of whether, as the physicalists believe, that, consciousness comes from physicality, that is, the brain and the various functions of the brain, or whether consciousness is fundamental and the brain and forms are just a form of consciousness, and that brings up the question, well, where does water fit into that scheme? If it's more an idealist theme than it is a fit theme. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love this idea that water is the glove on the hand of consciousness, that consciousness only has effect in the world through the effects of water somehow. And even when we're exploring ideas of whether water eats and digests and, whether water has these functions of life, loosely, I think it's true. Water is the universal solvent. It's dissolving things within itself all the time. You could say it's eating all the time. It, facilitates digestion in every other living being. There's no digestion without water, and certainly water can transmute different things that are dissolved within it and can be the cleansing and clearing factor that in different ecosystems. So does it eat and digest? Maybe it does in some ways.
Yeah, you could probably extend that into, consuming and it gets rid of things as well. It can push things out of its way.
And out of its extracellular matrix with the exclusionary zone water and filter through things, which is sort of a digestive process.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, some of the work of Jerry Pollack is extremely interesting, that when water meets up, we talk about biological surfaces and how biological surfaces in the body and whatever can structure water according to the needs that need be. It's so interesting that, up against a hydrophilic substance, that it will actually exclude all of its solutes and make room only for, that's what the exclusion zone is excluding its solutes, and it's just the pure water matrix, that's up against that surface. And it's amazing at how well it can, like I said before, both structurally and vibrationally encompass just about everything, but be able to store it well contained within these solute shells so that it doesn't interfere with the overall matrix. So as the cyberneticists would say, it's able to undergo change without loss of its organization. It never loses who it is by what's put into it. And I think that may be a lesson for all of us, is to remain who we are no matter what comes into us. And that's a way that we can sort of look to water as a model, hydromimicry model in terms of behavior.
Absolutely. Water teaches how to be better humans in so many ways. Water teaches us character and integrity in so many ways. I'm curious if you've ever seen a water miracle, whether that is, water to wine miracle, something that intense, or a water healing that you've witnessed, or even, dry barren landscape incorporating some of these hydromimicry practices and becoming, a lush food forest in a place where people thought that nothing could grow. It could be along a spectrum. Of course, there are many kinds of water miracles, but I'm curious what kinds of water miracles you've witnessed.
Water miracles. That's a good question. I think from a personal viewpoint, probably the greatest water miracle was something that I've already talked about. That moment when I running my hands along the surface and feeling the surface tension of the water and the softness and so forth, that it suddenly kicked in kind of an intuitional understanding. Other miracles, I don't know. It's sort of a miracle substance. So wherever it goes, whatever it does, it seems a bit miraculous. I don't really work in the healing field as such, so I wouldn't have occasion to probably run across a miracle in terms of that kind of connotation. But I know in a healing kind of for myself that being in water is one of the most not only pleasurable, but one of the most freeing things that I do on this planet. And I don't know what I would do without being close to water, either oceans or lakes or whatever. So from a very personal perspective, that is a miracle. I mean, I can be my mood, it can change my mood, it can change my energy, it can change my, how I'm feeling, it can change a whole lot of things. And how it does that, I don't know exactly because I'm not even, it's on my skin. So when I'm in contact with water, then the water is changing its structure on my skin and everything that I'm touching. And how that affects me in terms of a mechanism, I don't know, but it's a miracle in terms of what it can do for me personally.
Absolutely. I'd venture to say that the blue mind effect is a very real miracle. Dr. Wallace J. Nichols' work in terms of the psychological effects of being in or near water are profound. People have had incredible healings, even from acute traumatic PTSD, where they're barely able to function in the world. And they, start spending more and more time in water. And it seems to wash away those layers of the psyche, those stones of trauma that are held in the energetic body are just kind of, washed downstream just by the proximity to water. Even just the sound of water alone can have that kind of miraculous effect on the human psyche. And maybe again, there's that mirroring because our mind is so much water that when we are around clean, clear, flowing waters, it allows our mind to flow in a more clean and clear and unobstructed way.
It may be, yeah. I find that happens with me. I really do. It's been, it's the one constant source of tranquility and just pure joy to be in. And whether I'm surfing, whether I'm just taking a shower, whether I'm doing whatever, it's something that I've looked forward to from the time I was a kid. And I think that's those of us, I think, who are touched that way with water end up spending a lot of time talking about it, studying it, trying to understand it. And and I think it's really the mystery is with as much as we know and as much as we can kind of glean from other cultures and, other people at different times and what we know about it in a lot of different ways, still so much of it remains a mystery.
Friends, are you thirsty for spring water in its purest, wildest form, untouched by chemicals or processing, but maybe you don't have a nearby spring where you can harvest your own? We've got you covered with Alive Waters. They deliver fresh, raw, unprocessed spring water straight from a pristine, natural primary spring right to your doorstep. This water is wild and undomesticated, just like nature intended, packed with minerals and full of life force energy. And the best part? It's delivered in stunning, eco-friendly Flower of Life glass bottles designed to energize the water even further with sacred geometry. Delivery is available in Austin, San Antonio, Miami, San Francisco, LA, Portland, and New York. If you're not in one of those areas, no worries, you can still order their beautiful Flower of Life glassware from anywhere. Just head over to waterislife.shop for all the details and use the code WaterIsLife for 15% off your order.
That we can't explain and may never be able to. And I feel sort of the same as, consciousness. That may not be explicable in any way that we can explain it in this world as we know it, because I think we're limited. And I don't think either water or consciousness are limited. I think we constantly try to put our understandings and our labels on it, but I don't think they do justice because they can't. Not because we don't want to, but because they're so profound that trying to get some kind of coherent explanation of what's going on becomes virtually impossible.
Absolutely. Well, that's a perfect segue into the next question that I like to ask everyone, which is utterly unanswerable because, as you just eloquently explained, this is an inexplicable mystery. But as someone who has spent decades studying water and writing at length about water's mysteries, what is water in your perspective? There's no definitive answer to that, of course, but based on your understanding of water, what would you say is?
Boy, that's a good one. That's a good one. Yeah, I'm going to step completely out of my scientific shoes at this point and say that water is, as I wrote in the last chapter of my first book, is a universal mediator. It is not the stuff that you stare at and go, "Isn't that amazing?" But it is behind. Maybe I like your metaphor about the glove and the hand. And you look at the hand, but you don't really focus on the glove, but the glove is doing everything. So I think water, what is it? I think it is this universal mediator. I think and is it the physical counterpart of the non-physical consciousness, ether, kasha, whatever, so many cultures have had so many names for it. Yeah, it could be. It's a mystery, but I think the potential is there.
Yeah, signs keep pointing in that direction, but it's almost an unprovable thing. We just keep seeing the signs and seeing the signs and seeing the signs, but that's like reading a menu versus eating the actual meal. We may not ever be able to really do that, at least in these physical bodies with our limited perceptions. I think it's a bit like trying to see the totality of something from within that thing. We are bodies of water living on a water planet in a water universe. We are so in it that it's impossible for us to take ourselves outside of it and see the totality of it and say, oh, this is what it is. Because, if you're inside of a box, you can't look at the outside of the box and say what color the box is. You're in it.
Right. And every attempt that we make to look at the outside of the box is affected because we're in the box. Yeah. And I think this is what's happening with science right now. There's kind of a revolution. I mean, physics cruised along for a long time with, discovery and success one after another, but they're sort of stymied now because us trying to look at something that we're a part of necessarily affects what we're looking at because it's part of us. And so I think it gets back to what you and I were talking about. It will remain a mystery because where we sit right now, we can't see the outside of the box. And all we can try to do is take our observations, which are jaded by our being in the box, to try to explain what's going on. And I think it gives us some insights into the miraculous things that water does, but will never be able to give us a conceptual understanding of the mystery.
Right. Even as we try to perceive it, where everything we see through the lens of water, the lens of our eyes is 99% water. Everything we touch, all of our senses are mediated by water. Our sense of touch, our sense of smell, everything is mediated by water. Even our ability to cogitate and perceive of these ideas, every synapse that fires, it's firing through this network of water. It's impossible to get an objective perspective of it because we are it. We are water trying to understand water. And at some point, it's just good to surrender into the mystery and just live in that state of awe, which I think is one of the most enjoyable human experiences. And I think the fact that I love the experience of awe so much is probably why I've dedicated my life to water, because you can't look into water without being in awe.
I can't, at least. We share that in common. No, it is truly, quote unquote, awesome in that respect.
And if water had a message for us, rather than trying to define what water is, maybe there's something that water would want to share or express. If water had a message for humanity, or even just had a message specifically for the listeners of this podcast, the people who are interested in our mysteries, what do you think that would be?
Message. Well, one thing I would be relatively certain of is that water's message is not to draw attention to itself. It is about supporting everything else. And I would say if there's a message, it would be, enjoy the wonders of what this is, of what water is, of what it creates, what it does. And sometimes, and I'll step out of my scientific role without even worrying about how exactly it functions. Just be in awe of life, of water, and who we are, and what the universe is, and whether that's a manifestation of consciousness or a physical reality or whatever. Just to be who we are and enjoy it.
And if you had a piece of homework or two for the listeners, some practical takeaways that they could go home and deepen their relationship with water, or deepen their expression of water's character, or something to look into to study further about water on the next step in their water journey, what would be a piece of homework or two?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to my personal story and the way that I became so interested and so much involved with water, and that is being in water. And being in water without thinking or doing things that would take your attention away from the water. I would always say, because I lived in Hawaii for a decade, is that my best chance to get somebody to really realize what water is to somehow get them into the water. And I still say that's probably it. I think there's a a whole lot of intellectual pursuits that may be awestruck, for people. But I think the actual physical touch and really just being calm and kind of feeling the water itself would be my recommendation. Biotic one.
I love that. It's, I say that often as a water teacher, and I'm sure you're the same, as people who teach about the water. All we can really do is say water is the teacher. She herself is the teacher. Like there's nothing that can substitute for that intimate relationship and for the things that she will show you. You can read about water all day long, but until you're actually learning from water directly, it's a poor substitute. So how can people get in touch with you? How can they learn more about your work? How can they stay connected with the leading edge of what you're up to these days?
Probably the best way is my website, which is Water Sciences, plural, watersciences.org. And from there, there's links to order my books, various water insights that I've collected over the last 20, 25 years, or things, short paragraphs, gee whiz water things, and a little about what I'm doing and who I am and what my background is. But mostly sharing insights from different people who I've worked with water. One of the things we didn't talk about was the sort of connection between art and water, which is an interesting one. And I think another way that people can connect non-intellectually to water. But I would say the website is the best way to do it. And from there, if anybody has questions, there's an email there. They can drop me an email and I'd be glad to answer it.
Well, sciences.org. I recommend everyone go check out West Marrin's work. And thank you so much, West, for being with us today. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for all that you have contributed to the water world and to awakening this awe in so many people. And to everyone who's listened, thank you for being with us today. And as always, be well and stay hydrated.
Friends, if you're loving what you're learning on the podcast and you want to dive deeper, check out the courses, webinars, workbooks, and private coaching available at waterislife.academy. These are on-demand, lifetime access programs where we dive into brand new concepts not taught here on the podcast. And if you're ready to optimize your water to be a healthy wellspring of hydration, discover the water alchemy tools that are available at waterislife.shop. And let's connect on Instagram @JenIsabelFriend. I look forward to seeing you there. Stay hydrated and be well.